I got home from work to find all my stuff dumped on the front lawn. My dad was standing there with his phone out. "You're 28, sucking us dry like a goddamn vampire. I want you gone." My brother kicked my bag into the street. "Later, loser. We're changing the Wi-Fi password too." The across-the-street neighbors were out on their porch watching like it was a show. I didn't say a word, just started throwing everything into my car. When I was done, I walked right up to them, looked each one in the eye. "Hope you all sleep good tonight, because one day, none of you are gonna sleep at all." Then I peeled out. 10 days later, my phone was blowing up. 88 messages. "Dad, where the hell are you?" "Brother, dude, Dad's legit freaking out back." "Mom, 2:12 a.m. This needs to stop now. Call me back immediately." Before I tell you about the catastrophic fallout that completely destroyed my father's reputation and changed my life forever, please let me know where you are watching from in the comments down below. Thank you for being here. Grab a warm cup of coffee, sit back, and let me tell you the whole story. The drive away from the house I had lived in for 28 years was the quietest moment I have ever experienced. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't roll down the windows to let the cool night air hit my face. I just gripped the steering wheel of my 10-year-old Honda Civic so tight my knuckles turned completely white, the plastic digging into the calluses on my palms. The streetlights overhead flickered in a rhythmic, yellow blur, casting long, stretching shadows across my dashboard. My scrubs still smelled heavily of harsh chemical disinfectant, mixed with the faint, metallic tang of blood from a brutal 14-hour shift at the emergency veterinary hospital. I was exhausted down to my very bones. I glanced up into the rearview mirror. The 2-story suburban house I grew up in was shrinking rapidly into the distance, swallowed by the darkness of the tree-lined street. I did not shed a single tear. People always assume that when your own flesh and blood throws you out like a bag of garbage in front of the whole neighborhood, you break down. They picture you pulling over to the shoulder of the highway, slamming your fists against the steering wheel, and sobbing uncontrollably. But I felt absolutely none of that. What I felt was a cold, sharp, razor-like clarity spreading slowly through my chest. It felt exactly like standing in the freezing rain at a funeral for a family that was still breathing. For 28 years, my name was Matthew. To the outside world, to my coworkers and the clients at the hospital, I was just a hardworking guy trying to make a living and save a few animals along the way. But inside those 4 walls of my family home, I was the invisible maid. I was the silent ATM machine. I was the ultimate scapegoat for every single thing that went wrong in their lives. My father, Charles, was a man who cared deeply about exactly 2 things in this world: his pristine image in our upper-middle-class neighborhood, and his absolute, unquestioned control over the people under his roof. My mother, Martha, had perfected the art of looking the other way, folding her hands in her lap and staring at the wall whenever Charles raised his voice. And then there was Elijah, my younger brother, the golden child, the one who could do absolutely no wrong, even as he actively drained the life out of everything around him. As I drove further away from the manicured lawns of the suburbs and closer to the cheap, neon-lit motel district out by the interstate, I realized my phone was sitting on the passenger seat, completely dark and silent. Not a single text asking if I was safe. Not a single call to see where I was going to sleep that night. Just absolute, devastating silence. And you know what? That was fine. I needed that silence. I welcomed it. Because to understand why 88 desperate, panicked messages would flood that exact same phone just 10 days later, you have to understand the invisible, suffocating chains I had been dragging around for years. You have to understand what it takes to push a loyal son to the absolute breaking point, and what happens when the scapegoat finally decides to walk away and let the wolves eat each other. The truth is, my violent eviction did not start on that front lawn under the glaring porch lights. It had been brewing like a toxic storm for years, hidden carefully behind closed doors, polished mahogany tables, and fake, tight-lipped smiles. I worked as an emergency surgical technician at one of the busiest, highest-volume animal hospitals in the state. My shifts were notoriously brutal. 14 hours straight on my feet, sprinting between trauma bays, dealing with panicked, sobbing families, and physically wrestling with terrified, injured animals. I spent my days keeping things stitched together when everything else was falling apart. But the real, bone-crushing exhaustion started the exact moment I turned my key in the front door of my parents' house. I would walk in at 9 or 10 at night, dead on my feet, my back screaming in pain. The massive flat-screen television in the living room would be blasting some sports game or reality show. Elijah, a 25-year-old grown man, would be sprawled out on the expensive leather couch playing video games, surrounded by empty takeout boxes and half-empty soda cans. He hadn't held a steady job in 4 years. Whenever anyone asked, he claimed he was finding his true passion and waiting for the right opportunity to launch his tech startup. Meanwhile, my entire salary was bleeding out just to keep that house afloat. I was handing over nearly 70% of my hard-earned paychecks directly to my parents just to keep the lights on and the mortgage paid. I paid the exorbitant water and heating bills. I paid for my mother's expensive, out-of-pocket blood pressure medications because Charles refused to downgrade their premium cable package to afford it. I did the heavy grocery shopping on my rare, precious days off, lugging bags of food into a kitchen where no one ever offered to help me unpack. I was the silent, invisible engine keeping that household running smoothly so they could pretend everything was perfect. But if you asked my father, I was the ultimate failure of the family. I was the guy who didn't go to law school. I was the guy who worked a dirty, blue-collar job and came home smelling like bleach and wet fur. You need to be more like your brother, Charles would tell me, staring at me over the rim of his reading glasses while I scrubbed the kitchen counters. Elijah is building a network. He's thinking big. You're just settling for mediocrity, Matthew. It's embarrassing. He actually used that word. Embarrassing. I never fought back. I just swallowed the bile rising in my throat, gripped the sponge a little tighter, and kept scrubbing. I had convinced myself that family was family. You endure the tough times because that's what a good son does. You don't abandon your blood. I was paying the bills, keeping my head down, and secretly stashing whatever pennies I had left into a small savings account, hoping one day I could afford a down payment on a tiny apartment of my own. I didn't realize it at the time, but my silence wasn't keeping the peace. It was just giving them permission to slowly destroy me. I was the foundation of the house, and they were busy taking a sledgehammer to my knees, fully expecting the roof to stay up. I remember a specific, suffocating family dinner about 3 weeks before the incident on the lawn. It was a Sunday evening. My Uncle Wyatt had come over. Wyatt was my father's older brother, a loud, obnoxious man who loved nothing more than to stir the pot and watch the water boil. He sat at the head of the dining table, aggressively sawing into his steak, and looked right at me with a condescending smirk playing on his oily lips. "So, Matthew," Wyatt said, his voice booming over the clinking of silverware, "still cleaning up dog messes for a living? When are you going to get a real career? Your father tells me you're still living under his roof, eating his food." I put my fork down slowly. The dining room suddenly felt 10 degrees hotter. I looked directly at my father, waiting for him to correct Wyatt, waiting for him to mention that my paycheck paid for the very steak Wyatt was currently chewing on, waiting for him to mention that I paid the electricity bill that kept the chandelier above our heads glowing. But Charles didn't say a word in my defense. He just took a slow sip of his expensive craft beer, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, and nodded in agreement. "He's stuck in a rut," Charles said, not even making eye contact with me. He looked at Wyatt like I wasn't even sitting in the room. "Needs a push. A real man provides for himself. Not like Elijah here, who's got that massive tech interview coming up with the investors." Elijah didn't have a tech interview. Elijah had spent the entire college fund my grandfather left us, money that was supposed to be split evenly between the two of us, on a failed, ridiculous app idea and a 2-month networking vacation to Europe. My parents had let him drain the account dry, and when I asked about my half for a certification program, I was told the family needed to support Elijah's vision. But in my father's twisted eyes, Elijah was a brilliant visionary taking bold risks, and I was a pathetic parasite refusing to leave the nest. Wyatt leaned in closer to my father, dropping his voice into a loud, conspiratorial whisper. You need to be careful, Charles. You have to protect the family inheritance from freeloaders. Sometimes you have to teach a boy a hard lesson in front of the world so he learns how to be a man. He literally said that word. Inheritance. As if there was some massive, sprawling fortune to protect, and not just a terrifying mountain of hidden credit card debt that I was secretly paying the minimum balances on every single month. My jaw locked so tight my teeth ground together. A thick vein throbbed painfully against my temple. I looked at my mother, Martha. She was intensely focused on arranging the peas on her plate, refusing to look up, refusing to intervene. She knew the truth. She knew I paid for her pills. But her silence was her survival mechanism. "Maybe Wyatt is right," Charles muttered, tapping his knife against his plate. "Maybe things around here have been too easy for too long." I gripped the edge of the table beneath the tablecloth. I stayed quiet. I swallowed the humiliation whole, letting it burn a hole right through my stomach. I didn't know it then, but Wyatt had just planted the toxic seed in my father's head. The idea of a public execution. The idea that breaking me out in the open would somehow magically turn Elijah into a success and fix my father's crumbling financial reality. Things at the hospital weren't much easier, but at least the chaos there was honest. We had a relatively new resident doctor named Dylan. Dylan drove a brand new, silver sports car, wore custom scrubs, and had a wealthy father who sat on the hospital's board of directors. He also possessed the medical instincts of a rock. He walked the halls with a massive ego, treating the technicians and nurses like his own personal servants. One stormy, chaotic Tuesday night, the heavy double doors of the clinic flew open, banging loudly against the walls. A man rushed in, his clothes soaked with rain, carrying a massive, unresponsive Caucasian shepherd in his arms. The man was Julian, a prominent local real estate developer, a guy widely known to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His dog, Duke, had suffered a severe gastric torsion, commonly known in the veterinary world as bloat. The dog's stomach had twisted, trapping gas and cutting off blood supply. It was a brutal, agonizing condition. It was a race against the clock. Minutes meant the difference between life and death. Dylan was the attending resident. He took one look at the massive, dying dog on the stainless steel trauma table, looked at the erratic blips on the heart monitor, and completely froze. The color drained from his face. He started stuttering orders that made absolutely no medical sense, asking for medications that would drop the dog's blood pressure even further. He was panicking, his hands shaking violently as he tried to insert an 4-line and failed twice, leaving blood smeared across the dog's shaved leg. I didn't wait. I didn't ask for permission. I physically pushed past Dylan, bumping his shoulder hard enough to move him out of the way. "Hey, what do you think you're—" Dylan started to yell. "Shut up and step back," I barked, my voice echoing off the tile walls. I grabbed the large-bore trocar to immediately relieve the deadly pressure building in the dog's stomach. I secured the 4 lines smoothly on the first try, pushed the emergency fluids, and barked orders to the junior techs to prepare the surgical suite before Dr. Gray, the head surgeon, even sprinted through the doors. I kept that dog's heart beating. I stabilized him while Dylan stood uselessly in the corner, his mouth hanging open. Dr. Gray scrubbed in and took over the surgery. She didn't say much that night while we operated, but over her surgical mask, her eyes locked onto mine with a sharp, calculating, intense respect. Dylan, of course, tried to take the credit the next morning. I overheard him standing by the coffee machine, telling the administrative staff how he expertly directed the code and kept everyone calm. I let him talk. I didn't care about the applause or the office politics. I cared about doing the actual work. I cared about the fact that Julian's dog was breathing. But as I washed the dried blood off my forearms in the break room sink, staring at my exhausted reflection in the mirror, the contrast hit me like a physical punch. Here, in the real world, I was the guy keeping hearts beating. I was competent, fierce, and respected by the people who actually mattered. But the moment I walked through the front door of my family home, I was reduced to nothing. I was a punching bag. That duality was tearing my mind apart, and it was about to reach its breaking point. My absolute breaking point did not happen in the high-stress environment of the trauma bay. It happened in the quiet, mundane setting of my parents' kitchen. It was a Thursday morning, exactly 2 days before the lawn incident. I had a rare day off. I sat at the kitchen island with my laptop open, logging into the joint family bank account to pay the quarterly property tax bill. This was the account where 60% of my salary was directly deposited every 2 weeks, the account my mother supposedly managed for household expenses. I typed in the password. The screen loaded. I stared at the dashboard. The balance was almost zero. $6,000. Gone. Evaporated. I felt a cold sweat break out across the back of my neck. I refreshed the page. I checked the transaction history. A massive withdrawal had been made in person at the local branch just 24 hours ago. The property tax was due on Friday. If it wasn't paid, the penalty fees would be astronomical. I printed the bank statement, the paper feeling heavy in my trembling hands. I walked slowly into the living room. Charles was sitting in his recliner, casually reading the morning newspaper. Martha was knitting a scarf on the love seat. Elijah was lying flat on his back on the couch, aggressively tapping away on his phone. "Where is the money?" I asked. My voice was incredibly low. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't crying. It was a dangerously calm, hollow sound. Charles didn't even flinch. He slowly lowered his newspaper, annoyed by the interruption. "What on earth are you talking about, Matthew?" $6,000 was withdrawn from the joint account yesterday afternoon, I said, holding up the piece of paper. "It's completely gone. The property tax is due tomorrow." Martha suddenly looked incredibly interested in her knitting needles, her fingers moving erratically. Elijah didn't even pause his texting. "Your brother needed some fast capital," Charles said, his voice instantly taking on that defensive, arrogant edge he always used whenever he knew he was completely in the wrong. "It's a business investment. He's starting a consulting firm. He needed the cash for LLC registration, branding, and a new laptop. Family supports family, Matthew. You wouldn't understand business." I stared at him, my vision actually tunneling. That was my salary. I worked 80 hours last week. I worked overtime on Thanksgiving so we would have that money for the taxes. Charles stood up. He threw the newspaper onto the glass coffee table so hard a ceramic mug next to it shattered on the hardwood floor. He stepped right up to me, pushing his chest forward, his face turning a deep, angry crimson. "Your money," Charles roared, spit flying from his lips. "You sleep under my roof. You eat my food. You use my electricity. You are a 28-year-old man living at home like a pathetic child, and you dare question how I manage the finances of this house." "I pay the mortgage, Dad," I said, my voice finally cracking like dry wood snapping in half. "I pay for everything. That was the ultimate mistake. You never, ever tell a raging narcissist the cold, hard truth about their own failures." Charles could not handle the reality that his discarded, unloved son was the only thing keeping him out of total bankruptcy. His ego simply couldn't process it. "Get out," Charles hissed, pointing a shaking finger at the front door. "What?" I said, "Get out. You think you're so smart? You think you don't need us? Let's see how long you last in the real world without me providing for you. I want every single piece of your garbage out of my house. Tonight." 2 days later, he made good on his threat. I came home from work to find my life scattered across the wet grass. He had actually called the neighbors to watch. He actually held up his phone to record my humiliation, hoping to break my spirit in front of an audience, just like Uncle Wyatt suggested. He wanted me to fall to my knees, cry, and apologize for disrespecting his ultimate authority. Instead, I looked right into his camera, made my promise, and drove away. I pulled my Honda into the cracked, weed-choked parking lot of the Starlight Motel around midnight. It was the kind of desolate place where the neon sign buzzed loudly like an angry hornet, and half the pink letters were permanently burned out. I paid for a week up front in cash. The room smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke, cheap pine bleach, and old despair. The carpet was damp near the bathroom door. I carried my 2 duffel bags inside, dropped them on the floor, locked the deadbolt, and slid the security chain into place. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. The springs creaked loudly in the empty room. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. Felt heavy. I opened my audio files. Right before I started picking my scrubs and boots off the wet lawn, I had reached into my pocket and blindly hit the voice memo button. I didn't even know why I did it at the time. Pure survival instinct, maybe. I pressed play. The audio was slightly muffled by the fabric of my pants, but the voices were crystal clear. I heard the rushing sound of a passing car in the background. I heard the wind rustling the oak trees. And then I heard my father's voice, booming, arrogant, and vicious. "You're 28, sucking us dry like a goddamn vampire. I want you gone. Tonight." Then came the heavy thud of a sneaker hitting canvas. My brother. Later, loser. "We're changing the Wi-Fi password too." I listened to that minute-long clip 3 times in the dark room. I didn't listen to it to torture myself. I didn't listen to it to wallow in self-pity. I listened to it to forge armor. Because I knew the people I was dealing with. By tomorrow morning, the narrative would change. Charles would tell the neighbors I had a mental breakdown. Martha would cry to her friends that I was unstable. Elijah would post online that I stormed out over a minor disagreement. They survived by twisting reality. But audio does not lie. Audio does not gaslight you. Audio remembers exactly how the knife went in. Around 2 a.m., the screen of my phone lit up the dark room. It buzzed violently against the cheap nightstand. A text from Elijah. "LOL. Hope you like sleeping in your car. Dad says you owe him $500 for the scratch on the front door when you moved your heavy junk." 5 minutes later, a text from Charles. "Don't bother coming back crawling to us tomorrow morning. The locks are already changed. You're completely done." I did not type a single letter in reply. I took a screenshot of the texts. I created a new, secure folder on my phone. I named it Evidence. I dropped the screenshots and the audio file inside. I lay back on the thin pillow, staring up at the water stains on the ceiling. I was entirely alone. I had $300 to my name. I had no permanent address. But as my eyes adjusted to the dark, a strange, powerful sensation washed over me. No one was going to demand I fix the coffee maker at 6 a.m. No one was going to ask me for $50 before I even brushed my teeth. For the first time in 28 years, I belonged entirely to myself. The next morning, the sun came up, burning off the fog over the highway. I put on a fresh, clean set of navy blue scrubs, drove down the street to a cheap diner, and ordered a black coffee and eggs. Carter walked in 10 minutes later. The bell above the diner door jingled. Carter slid his massive frame into the vinyl booth across from me. He was an EMT I had worked alongside in the ER for years. He was built like a brick wall, tattooed down both arms, and possessed the kind of quiet, steady, unflappable personality you desperately want beside you when someone is bleeding out on a stretcher. "You look like absolute hell, man," Carter said, flagging down the tired waitress for his own coffee. "Bags under your eyes are big enough to carry groceries." I didn't smile. I just looked at him and told him everything. I didn't sugarcoat the story. I didn't try to protect my parents' reputation. I laid it all out on the sticky diner table. The missing $6,000, Elijah's theft, the screaming on the lawn, the neighbors watching, the audio recording, and the mocking text messages from the night before. Carter listened in absolute, unbroken silence. He didn't offer empty pity. He didn't tell me everything was going to be okay. He just slowly stirred his coffee, the spoon clinking against the ceramic mug. Finally, he leaned across the table and looked me dead in the eye. "Let me ask you a question," Carter said, his voice a low rumble. "If they call you tonight crying, if your mother gets on the phone and begs you to come home, saying they made a terrible mistake, would you go back?" I looked down at the dark surface of my coffee. I thought about the smell of my motel room. I thought about the way my mother looked away while my father screamed. I thought about the phone in my father's hand, recording my pain for his own twisted entertainment. "No," I said, and I meant it. Good, Carter nodded firmly. Because if you go back, Matthew, they will destroy you completely. You are not dealing with a misunderstanding. You are dealing with an infection. You don't negotiate with an infection. You cut it out of your body and you let the wound heal. Carter reached across the table and tapped my phone. Change your emergency contacts. Today. Right there in the diner while my eggs got cold, I opened my phone settings. I navigated to my medical and emergency contacts. I deleted Martha Brooks. I deleted Charles Brooks. I typed in Carter's name and his cell number. It was just a few simple taps on a glass screen, but the psychological impact was staggering. It felt like dropping a massive, impenetrable steel vault door between my past and my future. I was officially severing the cord. I was cutting them off from my life, my emergencies, my reality. I paid the bill, drove straight to the hospital, and marched into the scheduling office. I picked up 3 extra overnight shifts. I worked until my hands physically cramped. I worked until my vision blurred and my feet went completely numb. But when I finally dragged myself back to the motel at dawn, the silence in my room was beautiful. While I was finding my footing in the sterile halls of the hospital, back at the Brooks house, the silence was rapidly turning into a living nightmare. It didn't take weeks for the reality of my absence to hit them. It took exactly 3 days. By day 3, the tone of the text messages lighting up my phone began to drastically change. The arrogant anger began to curdle into sheer, unadulterated panic. My phone vibrated violently in my locker while I was prepping a surgical tray. I checked it on my break. It was a text from Charles. Matthew, where did you put the login folder for the utility portal? The gas bill is locked. An hour later, another one buzzed through. The pharmacy is saying your mother's blood pressure prescription requires a $200 copay. You always handle this online. Fix it right now. Then, later that afternoon, a desperate text from Elijah. Dude, the Wi-Fi is completely shut off. Dad is screaming at me to figure it out and I don't know the provider PIN. Just text me the account info. I swear I won't tell him you helped. I sat on the bench in the locker room, staring at the glowing screen, and I actually laughed out loud. It was a dark, dry laugh. They weren't missing their son. They weren't missing my presence at the dinner table. They were missing the unpaid labor. They were missing the human shield that stood directly between them and the brutal consequences of their own utter incompetence. When I was living there, Charles called me a vampire sucking them dry. But the second I was gone, they couldn't even manage to buy basic medication or keep the internet running. On day 5, I got a long message from Caleb. Caleb was my cousin, a guy who always played the innocent peacemaker at family gatherings. Hey man, the text read. Heard things got totally crazy the other night. Just checking in on you. Let me know where you're staying. Maybe I can drop off some hot food or something for you. We're family, man. We gotta stick together through the hard times. It sounded incredibly nice. It sounded genuine. But I knew Caleb better than anyone. He was Charles's little informant. The rat. He wanted my physical address so my father could drive over, kick the door down, and drag me back by the collar to pay the bills. I replied with one single sentence. I'm fine, Caleb. Enjoy the peace and quiet. I knew he would immediately screenshot that and send it directly to Charles. Let them spin their wheels. Let them drown in the mess they created. The greatest revenge I could possibly enact wasn't screaming or fighting. My revenge was simply my total, absolute absence. But the real, devastating storm wasn't just happening inside the walls of their house. It was hitting the entire neighborhood. You see, when a grown man throws his son's belongings on the front lawn under bright porch lights and yells loud enough to wake the dead, people notice. People talk. On day 8, I got a phone call from an unknown number. I answered it cautiously. Matthew, honey, is that you? It was Sarah, the elderly woman who lived directly across the street from my parents. I had watered her plants and fixed her gutters a few times when she went on vacation. It's me, Sarah. I'm safe, I said softly. Oh, thank God, she breathed out. Good. because I need to tell you exactly what is happening over here. Your father was at the neighborhood association meeting yesterday evening. He stood up and tried to tell everyone that you had a severe mental breakdown, that you were stealing from them, and that you completely abandoned the family in a manic state. My stomach tightened. What did you say, Sarah? I didn't let him finish, she said, her voice trembling with righteous anger. I stood up in the middle of the rec center, Matthew. I pointed my finger right at his face. I told everyone in that room exactly what Charles Brooks did to his hardworking son. I told them I was sitting on my porch that night. I saw Elijah kick your bag. I saw your father holding his phone up like a cruel teenager. I told them you are the only reason that house isn't in foreclosure. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the wall of the break room. Matthew, your father's face turned the color of spoiled milk, Sarah continued, practically vibrating with triumph. He tried to deny it, but two other neighbors chimed in and said they heard the yelling too. Nobody is talking to him. The whole block knows the truth. He's a pariah, the image of my father, a man who worshipped his public reputation above his own flesh and blood. Being publicly unmasked and humiliated by a sweet old lady in a cardigan was almost too massive to process. And it wasn't just the neighbors. According to Sarah, Uncle Wyatt, the very man who instigated the whole lawn incident, had completely backpedaled to save his own skin. Wyatt was telling everyone in town that Charles was an absolute lunatic for doing such a cruel thing to his own blood. Wyatt threw Charles right under the bus. My father was completely, utterly isolated. His reputation was in ashes. That was exactly why, by day 10, my phone was blowing up. 88 messages. He was desperate. He was drowning. And he was frantically trying to regain control of the narrative by dragging me back into the cage. But I wasn't in the cage anymore. While my father's carefully constructed world was burning to the ground, mine was quietly shifting into a completely new, unimaginable gear. On day 12, I was in the hospital break room, chewing on a stale protein bar and reviewing a chart, when the overhead intercom clicked on with a sharp burst of static. Matthew Brooks, please report to Dr. Gray's office immediately. Matthew Brooks to Dr. Gray. I threw the wrapper in the trash and walked down the long, sterile hallway. Being called directly to the surgical director's office usually meant one of two things in this industry. You were being fired for a massive mistake, or a wealthy client was suing and the lawyers were getting involved. I knocked twice and pushed open the heavy wooden door. Dr. Gray was sitting behind her massive mahogany desk, her hands folded neatly. Sitting in the plush leather guest chair across from her was Julian, the billionaire real estate developer whose dog I had saved a few weeks prior. Julian stood up immediately. He didn't just shake my hand. He gripped it with a vice-like intensity. Matthew, good to see you again, son. Duke is running around the backyard chasing tennis balls like a puppy. All thanks to you. I'm very glad to hear it, sir, I said, genuinely taken aback by his presence. Dr. Gray gestured for me to sit down in the empty chair. She looked at me with that same piercing, calculating gaze she used when she was analyzing an X-ray. Matthew, I don't like to waste time, so let's cut right to the chase, Dr. Gray said, her tone sharp and all business. I have watched you work in the trenches for 3 years. You are brilliant under pressure. You have better surgical instincts and far more empathy than most of the fully licensed veterinarians walking around this building, including Dr. Dillon, who, by the way, has been permanently reassigned to a low-volume clinic on the edge of town due to severe incompetence. I blinked, processing the information. Thank you, Dr. Gray. I just do my job. Don't thank me yet, she said, leaning forward. Julian here recently made a very generous financial donation to the hospital's expansion fund. It's enough to build an entirely new trauma wing. But he attached a very specific, non-negotiable condition to his money. Julian turned to me, a sharp, knowing smile on his face. I told the board of directors I only write the check if the guy who actually saved my dog, the guy who pushed the idiot doctor out of the way, gets put in charge of the new emergency surgical wing. My stomach dropped straight into my shoes. I stared at them, completely stunned. I appreciate that, Julian. More than you know. But I'm just a tech. I don't have the advanced administrative certification required for a director-level role. The board would never allow it. Dr. Gray pulled a thick manila folder out of her desk drawer and slid it across the polished wood toward me. It had my name printed on the tab. I took the liberty of digging deep into your employment and academic files, Matthew. You completed the Advanced Administrative and Surgical Certification courses online 2 years ago. You scored in the top percentile. You just never formally applied for the promotion. She was right. I had stayed up until 3 a.m. for 6 straight months taking those grueling online classes, but I never submitted the paperwork because Charles had convinced me I would fail the final board interview, and I didn't want the confrontation at home when he mocked me for trying. Effective at the end of this month, Dr. Gray said, tapping the heavy folder with her pen, you are the new Director of Emergency Surgical Operations. It comes with a private office, a dedicated staff under your command, and a salary that is, well, let's just say you won't be living in that cheap motel much longer. I sat in that chair, my hands physically shaking. The crushing weight of the past 28 years felt like it was suddenly evaporating into the sterile air of the office. I had spent my whole life being told I was broken, only to find out I was just a strong tree planted in toxic soil. Thank you, was all I could manage to whisper, my throat tight. We announce it publicly at the hospital's annual charity gala next week, Julian said, standing up and buttoning his expensive suit jacket. Make sure you buy a good suit, kid. You've earned it. I left that office feeling 10 feet tall, my mind racing with possibilities. But the universe has a very funny way of testing your resolve the exact moment you find your footing. I drove back to the Starlight Motel that evening. The sun was just starting to set, casting long, bruised orange shadows across the cracked asphalt. As I pulled my Honda into my designated parking spot, my blood ran instantly cold. The high from the promotion vanished in a split second. Parked directly in front of my motel room door was a familiar, massive dark blue pickup truck. My father. He was leaning heavily against the hood of the truck, his arms crossed tight over his chest. He looked terrible. The arrogant, untouchable man who had stood proudly on the lawn recording my humiliation was completely gone. In his place was an exhausted, frantic older man with deep, dark circles under his eyes and a wrinkled, stained shirt. Caleb, that little rat cousin of mine, had tracked my location through a mutual friend who worked at the hospital front desk, and he had fed the address straight to Charles. I turned off the engine. I didn't panic. The old Matthew, the boy who lived in that house, would have stayed locked in the car, heart pounding against his ribs, terrified of the impending yelling. The new Matthew just grabbed his keys, took a deep breath, and stepped out onto the pavement. Charles pushed himself off the truck as I approached. Matthew! His voice wasn't a roar anymore. It was a desperate, cracking bark. You need to leave, I said, not slowing my pace as I walked directly toward my door, not breaking eye contact. Don't turn your back on me, Charles snapped, the old anger flaring up, desperately trying to find traction. You are coming home, right now. Pack your bags. Your mother is an absolute wreck. The house is falling apart. Do you have any earthly idea what you are doing to this family? I stopped right at my door, the key in the lock, and slowly turned to face him. What I am doing? I'm existing, Charles. That's all. I'm just existing somewhere else. You made me look like a damn fool, he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. Sarah is telling the whole neighborhood lies about me. Wyatt won't even answer my phone calls. You need to come back, fix the bank accounts, and tell people it was a misunderstanding. There it was. He didn't want his son back. He didn't miss me. He wanted his publicist and his ATM machine back. He wanted me to save him from his own actions. Before I could answer, the door to the manager's office swung open. Mrs. Delaney, the tough as nails, chain-smoking woman who ran the motel, stepped out onto the concrete walkway. She was holding a heavy metal Maglite flashlight in her hand. Is there a problem here, Matthew? Mrs. Delaney asked, her eyes locked dead on my father. Charles sneered at her, trying to puff his chest out. This is private family business, lady. Back off. On my property, it's my business. Mrs. Delaney shot back, not stepping down an inch, tapping the flashlight against her palm. You raise your voice one more time, and I'm calling the cops to drag your truck out of here. Charles looked back at me, his face twisting with desperation. Tell her to go away, Matthew. Come home. Don't make me bring a lawyer into this to sort out that joint bank account. You owe us for raising you. I looked at the man who gave me half my DNA. I felt absolutely nothing but pity. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and opened my evidence folder. I turned the volume all the way up and pressed play. The sound of my father's own voice echoed off the concrete walls of the cheap motel. You're 28, sucking us dry like a goddamn vampire. I want you gone. Tonight. Charles froze. The color drained from his face completely, leaving him looking sickly pale. He stared at my phone like it was a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. He didn't realize I had recorded him that night. He didn't realize I held the ultimate, undeniable proof of his cruelty. You want to call a lawyer? I said quietly, stopping the recording. Go ahead, Charles. We can play this in court during the custody hearing for the bank accounts. We can play this for the entire neighborhood association. We can play it for Elijah's friends. You threw me away. You don't get to dig through the trash when you finally realize you threw away your wallet. Charles opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The absolute, crushing reality of his powerlessness finally hit him. He had nothing left to threaten me with. He couldn't evict me. He couldn't take my money. He couldn't shame me. He looked at me, looked at Mrs. Delaney holding the flashlight, and then, without saying a single word, he turned around. He got into his truck, slammed the heavy door, and drove out of the parking lot so fast his tires squealed against the pavement. I stood there in the quiet evening air, taking a deep breath. The storm was breaking, and I was standing right in the eye of it, completely untouched. But the final showdown. I arrived in a tailored, charcoal gray suit. It was the first piece of clothing I had ever bought for myself that didn't come from a discount rack or a uniform supply catalog. I stood near the entrance, adjusting my cuffs, feeling the smooth fabric against my wrists. It was a far cry from the wet, bleach-stained scrubs I was wearing the night my father threw my life onto the wet grass. I grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter and scanned the crowded room. It didn't take long to spot them. My father, Charles, was standing near the silent auction tables. He was wearing a tuxedo that looked just a little too tight around his waist. He had a stiff, desperate smile plastered across his face. He was actively trying to corner local politicians and wealthy business owners, aggressively shaking hands and laughing far too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. He was on a mission. His reputation in our neighborhood was entirely in ashes. The story of him dumping his hard-working son on the lawn had spread like wildfire. He was an absolute pariah on our street. This gala was his desperate attempt to network his way back into high society, to prove to everyone that he was still a respectable, successful patriarch. My mother, Martha, stood a few feet behind him, looking nervous and incredibly small, clutching a sequined purse like a shield. And then there was Elijah. My 25-year-old brother was hovering near the open bar, drinking free champagne and looking around with that familiar, arrogant smirk, completely oblivious to the financial ruin looming over his head. I took a deep breath and started walking toward the main dining area to find my assigned table. Well, look who it is. The tech cleaned up nicely. I stopped. Dylan, the arrogant resident doctor who had nearly killed Julian's dog, was standing right in my path. He was holding a glass of bourbon, wearing a velvet dinner jacket, and looking at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. Before I could say a word, I heard a familiar, booming voice behind me. Dr. Dylan, good to see you again. I didn't realize you were acquainted with my son. It was Charles. He walked up quickly, eager to rub elbows with anyone who had the title of doctor. Charles clapped me on the shoulder, but his grip was tight, almost painful. It was a warning grip, a demand for submission. We work together, Dylan said, taking a sip of his bourbon. He looked at Charles, then back at me, a cruel smile forming. Matthew here is one of our best floor technicians. He's great at cleaning up the operating room after the real doctors do the heavy lifting. I'm actually surprised they let the support staff buy tickets to this event. My father didn't defend me. He didn't mention my years of dedication. He didn't mention my skill. Instead, Charles laughed. He actually laughed, eager to bond with a wealthy doctor over my perceived inferiority. "Well, you know how it is, Dylan," Charles said, his voice loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "Some people are born to lead, and some are born to follow. Matthew has always struggled to find his ambition. He's always been comfortable with mediocrity. But we still support him. That's what family does." Dylan chuckled. Elijah had wandered over from the bar and was snickering behind his champagne glass. I looked at Charles. I looked at the desperate, sweating man trying to buy respect by selling out his own blood. I didn't yell. I didn't get angry. I just smiled. It was a calm, cold smile. "Enjoy the evening, Charles," I said perfectly calmly. "Enjoy the speeches." I turned my back on them and walked away. I walked straight to the front of the ballroom and took my seat at the head table, right next to Dr. Gray and Julian. An hour later, the dinner plates were cleared, and the lights in the grand ballroom dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd as Dr. Gray stepped up to the polished wooden podium. The microphone echoed slightly as she adjusted it. I glanced out into the sea of faces. I could see Charles, Martha, and Elijah sitting at a cheap table way in the back, near the kitchen doors. I could see Dylan sitting with a group of residents, puffing his chest out, completely convinced he was about to be recognized for his hard work. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight," Dr. Gray began, her voice commanding the massive room. "Tonight is about the future of emergency veterinary medicine. Thanks to a monumental, historic donation from Mr. Julian Vance, our hospital is breaking ground next month on a state-of-the-art emergency surgical trauma wing." The room erupted into polite applause. Julian, sitting next to me, raised his glass in a silent toast. "But a new facility is only as strong as the people running it," Dr. Gray continued, gripping the edges of the podium. "We need leadership that doesn't just understand medical theory, but understands the brutal, split-second reality of keeping a heart beating when everything is going wrong. We need someone who leads by action, not by ego. Someone who steps up when others freeze." Dylan leaned forward in his chair. He actually reached up to straighten his bow tie. He was completely ready to stand up. "The hospital board and our generous donors have unanimously agreed," Dr. Gray said, her voice ringing out loud and clear. "It is my absolute honor to introduce the brand new Director of Emergency Surgical Operations. Please join me in congratulating a man of incredible talent and integrity, Matthew Brooks." The ballroom exploded into thunderous applause. I stood up. Julian clapped me on the back. Carter, sitting a few tables over, let out a massive, booming cheer. I buttoned my suit jacket and walked slowly up the short stairs to the stage. But before I looked at the crowd, my eyes immediately locked onto the table in the back. It was like watching a photograph freeze in time. Dylan had literally dropped his crystal glass. It shattered on the floor, but he didn't even look down. His mouth was hanging open in pure, unadulterated shock. But it was my family's reaction that I will remember for the rest of my life. Charles was completely paralyzed. His face had drained of all color, leaving him looking like a wax statue. He was staring at me standing on that brightly lit stage, his brain entirely unable to process the reality unfolding in front of him. The son he had thrown on the lawn, the son he had just called a mediocre failure 10 minutes ago, was being handed the keys to the kingdom. Elijah was gripping the edge of the table, looking back and forth between me and Charles, panic finally setting into his eyes. Martha had both hands clamped over her mouth. I stepped up to the microphone. The applause died down. "Thank you," I said, my voice echoing through the massive room. "A title doesn't save lives. Steady hands, clear minds, and a refusal to quit save lives. I promise to run this new trauma center with the exact same dedication I have given this hospital for the last 3 years. We have a lot of work to do. Let's get to it. It was short. It was professional. I didn't thank my parents. I didn't mention my family. I didn't give them a single second of recognition, because they had no part in building the man standing on that stage. I walked off the stage to a standing ovation. The gala was winding down. I said my goodbyes to the hospital board members, shook a few dozen hands, and made my way out to the grand lobby toward the valet stand. The cool night air felt incredible against my face. My heart was beating steadily. I felt lighter than I had in 28 years. Matthew, wait. Son, wait. I heard the frantic footsteps echoing on the marble floor behind me. I stopped near the heavy glass doors, but I didn't turn around right away. I let him close the distance. Charles came jogging up, breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead. His tight tuxedo looked even more ridiculous now. He stopped a few feet from me, holding his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture. Matthew, Charles stammered, his arrogant voice completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, whining tone. I had no idea. Director of Operations? Why didn't you tell us? We are so incredibly proud of you. We need to celebrate. You need to come home tonight so your mother can make a proper dinner. We can put all this nonsense behind us. He was scrambling. The reality of his financial situation, the massive credit card debt, the unpaid property taxes, the complete lack of my massive salary entering his bank account, was crushing him. He saw my new promotion not as my success, but as his ultimate bailout. He thought he could just snap his fingers and command me back into the role of the obedient ATM machine. I finally turned to look at him. I looked him up and down. I saw a weak, terrified man who had built his entire life on the illusion of control. There is no us, Charles, I said quietly. You made that perfectly clear on the lawn. You wanted me gone. I am gone. You can't do this. Charles snapped, a flash of his old rage breaking through the panic. You are my son. You owe this family. If you walk away now, we lose the house. Elijah has nothing. I'll have to hire a lawyer to declare bankruptcy. The public humiliation. The humiliation is yours to carry? I interrupted, my voice sharp as glass. You built that house of cards. Now sit in it while it falls. Right at that moment, Julian walked out through the glass doors. He saw me and smiled warmly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy set of keys with a sleek leather fob. He tossed them through the air. I caught them easily in my right hand. Company car for the new director, Julian said, giving me a nod. Perks of the contract, Matthew. It's parked right out front. Drive safe. I looked down at the keys in my hand. Then I looked past Charles. Sitting perfectly under the bright lights of the hotel entrance was a brand new, jet black Porsche 911. The paint looked like liquid glass. Charles slowly turned his head to look at the car. His jaw physically dropped. His eyes widened. The absolute finality of my new status completely shattered whatever delusional hope he had left. He realized, right then and there, that he possessed absolutely nothing that I needed. He had zero leverage, zero power. I walked past Charles. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back. I opened the heavy door of the Porsche, slid into the luxurious leather seat, and pushed the ignition button. The engine roared to life with a deep, aggressive growl that echoed off the hotel walls. I rolled the window down just a few inches. Charles was standing on the curb, looking small, defeated, and utterly broken. I hope you sleep good tonight, Charles, I said over the rumble of the engine. I put the car in drive and pulled away, merging onto the highway, leaving the man who threw me away standing alone in the exhaust fumes. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment one below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The days and weeks following the charity gala were a masterclass in watching karma work with absolute, terrifying precision. At the hospital, my life settled into a fast-paced, highly rewarding rhythm. I moved into my new corner office. I completely restructured the trauma triage protocols, securing better pay and better hours for the technicians who actually kept the place running. Dr. Dillon, humiliated and exposed, was quietly transferred to a low-tier clinic on the edge of the county, his ego permanently bruised. But back in the neighborhood I used to call home, the walls were rapidly caving in. I didn't have to seek out the information. Found me. Sarah, the loyal neighbor, called me occasionally with updates, sounding like a war correspondent reporting from the front lines. Charles was a ghost. He stopped attending the neighborhood association meetings. He stopped going to his Saturday golf games. Everyone on the block knew exactly what he had done to me, and they knew about my massive promotion. He went from being the loud, boastful patriarch of the street to a man who checked his mailbox at midnight just to avoid making eye contact with his neighbors. The financial reality hit them like a freight train. Without my salary depositing into their account every 2 weeks, the facade crumbled instantly. My phone buzzed one Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing budget sheets. It was a massive wall of text from Elijah. "Matt bro, please, you have to answer me. Dad is losing his mind. The bank is threatening foreclosure on the house. Dad had to take out a second mortgage last year to cover the credit cards, and now we can't make the payments. My car got repossessed yesterday right out of the driveway. Mom is crying nonstop. Dad is talking about getting a divorce lawyer because they keep screaming at each other about money. Just send me $5,000. Just a loan, bro. I'll pay you back with interest when my startup launches. You're rich now. You drive a Porsche. Don't let your own family go homeless." I sat at my desk, reading the words. 3 months ago, a text like that would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have drained my own savings. I would have worked myself to the bone to save them. Now, I felt nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. Elijah wasn't asking for help to change his life. He was asking for a temporary bandage so he could continue being a parasite. He still believed the illusion of his startup. He still believed my money was his safety net. I swiped the notification away. I left the message on read. I didn't block him. I wanted him to see the read receipt. I wanted him to know that I saw his desperation, and I actively chose to do absolutely nothing about it. But the final attempt at manipulation didn't come through a text message. It came walking right through the front doors of my hospital. It was a rainy Friday afternoon. I was walking through the main lobby holding a stack of surgical reports when I heard my name. "Matthew." I stopped. Standing near the reception desk, dripping wet from the rain, was my mother, Martha. She looked frail. Her hair was messy, and she was wearing a raincoat that looked a size too big. She clutched her purse tightly against her chest. I walked over to her slowly, my guard immediately going up. "What are you doing here, Martha?" I didn't call her Mom. I hadn't used that word in my head since the night on the lawn. Tears instantly welled up in her eyes. It was the ultimate weapon. The weapon she had used for 28 years to avoid conflict, to excuse Charles's rage, and to keep me compliant. "Matthew, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You have to come home. Your father's heart, his blood pressure is through the roof. The stress is killing him. They are taking the house, Matthew. We have nowhere to go. Please, I know Charles was harsh, but we are your parents. You only get one family." I looked at the woman who had brought me into the world. I looked at the woman who had sat quietly on the couch, knitting a scarf, while my father falsely accused me of stealing and threw me out into the street. "You didn't need me when my bags were in the street," I said, my voice completely steady, devoid of any anger or malice. "You didn't need me when you watched Elijah spend my college fund. You didn't need me when Charles called me a failure." "I was scared," she cried, a tear rolling down her cheek. "You know how your father gets. I couldn't stop him. I'm just caught in the middle." "No, Martha," I said firmly, shaking my head. "You weren't caught in the middle. You chose a side. You chose the side of the abuser because it was comfortable for you. You sacrificed me to keep the peace. And now the peace is gone. and you just want my wallet to buy it back." She gasped, taking a step back as if I had physically struck her. "How can you be so cold? We raised you. You housed me." "I raised myself," I replied. I took a deep breath. "I am never coming back. I am not paying your debts. I am not saving Elijah. If Charles needs a lawyer for bankruptcy, he can find one himself. Do not ever come to my place of work again." I turned my back on her tears. I walked through the double doors into the secure surgical wing. I heard the heavy doors click locked behind me. It was the sound of a permanent boundary sliding into place. I never spoke to Martha again. 6 months passed. 6 months of absolute, uninterrupted peace. Life has a beautiful way of expanding when you finally remove the dead weight holding you down. I moved out of the Starlight Motel and bought a beautiful, 3-bedroom house in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood on the other side of the city. It had a massive backyard surrounded by a high wooden fence. I adopted a 3-legged golden retriever mix named Barnaby, who had been brought into the ER. My home was quiet. There was no screaming over the television. There was no slamming of cabinets. There was no knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach every time I put my key in the front door. I built a real family, a chosen family. I hosted Sunday barbecues in my backyard. Carter would come over and man the grill. Dr. Gray and Julian would stop by for a beer. We laughed. We talked about real things. We supported each other without keeping a transactional scorecard. I learned what it actually felt like to be valued for who I was, not for what I could provide. I thought the book was completely closed on the Brooks family. I thought there were no more secrets left to uncover. I was wrong. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in late October. I was walking down my driveway to check the mail before heading into the hospital. Inside the metal box, buried beneath a few grocery store flyers, was a plain white envelope. The handwriting on the front was sloppy, rushed, and instantly recognizable. Elijah. There was no return address. Just my name and my new address, which he had likely begged out of some distant relative. I walked into my kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and sat at the island. I used a butter knife to slice the envelope open. Inside was a single, crumpled piece of notebook paper. I unfolded it and began to read. "Matt, I know you hate me. I know you're not going to reply to this, but I have to tell someone because I feel like I'm going crazy. Everything is gone. The bank foreclosed on the house last month. Dad and Mom are living in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment near the highway. Dad got fired from his management job because his temper got so bad. I'm sleeping on a friend's couch. The startup failed. I have nothing." I took a sip of my coffee. It was tragic, yes, but it was exactly the destination they had been driving toward for years. I kept reading. "But that's not why I'm writing this. I'm writing this because I can't keep carrying the guilt. You need to know the truth about the $6,000. The money that disappeared from the joint account right before Dad threw you out." My eyes narrowed. I set the coffee mug down on the granite counter. "I didn't steal it without anyone knowing. Mom knew. I went to Mom that morning, crying. I told her I owed some really bad people money for a failed investment, and they were threatening me. Mom panicked. She gave me the password to the joint account. She told me to take the $6,000 before you used it to pay for your online classes or the taxes. She said we would figure out how to put it back later. But when Dad found out the money was gone and blamed you, Mom pulled me aside in the kitchen. She looked me right in the eye and told me to keep my mouth shut. She said Dad was already looking for a reason to kick you out to teach you a lesson, and if we let you take the fall, my secret would be safe." I stopped reading. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt impossibly thin. I had to read that paragraph twice just to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. Martha, my quiet, nervous, knitting mother, the woman who stood in the hospital lobby crying crocodile tears, playing the ultimate victim of my father's rage. She wasn't a victim at all. She was the architect. She had actively handed Elijah the knife to stab me in the back, and then she stood silently by, watching Charles twist the blade, just to protect her golden child from the consequences of his own actions. She sacrificed her hard-working son to save her lazy one. I sat at the kitchen island for a long time. I waited for the rage to hit me. I waited for the urge to scream, to smash my coffee mug against the wall, to drive over to their cheap apartment and kick the door in. But the rage never came. Instead, a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute freedom washed over my entire body. It was the final puzzle piece snapping perfectly into place. Any lingering doubt I had, any tiny voice in the back of my head whispering that maybe I was too harsh, that maybe I should have given them another chance, it all evaporated instantly. The entire system had been rigged from the very beginning. It was never about my lack of ambition. It was never about my disrespect. I was just a battery, and when the battery realized it was being drained, they tried to destroy it. I stood up. I walked over to the brick fireplace in my living room. I didn't bother turning on the gas. I just struck a long wooden match against the brick. I held the corner of Elijah's letter over the small flame. The cheap notebook paper caught fire quickly. The bright orange flame ate through the blue ink, burning away the apologies, the excuses, and the final, ugly truth. I dropped the burning paper onto the grate. I watched it curl and blacken, the smoke drifting up the chimney. I watched it until there was absolutely nothing left but a small pile of gray ash. I felt nothing but peace. The past was completely, undeniably dead. I turned around, grabbed my keys, whistled for Barnaby, and walked out the front door into the bright morning sun to go save some lives. I took the long way to work that morning. I drove the Porsche along the coastal highway, rolling the windows down, letting the cold, salty ocean air rush into the cabin. The engine hummed with a deep, powerful vibration beneath my hands. The morning sun was reflecting off the crashing waves, blinding and beautiful. I thought about the word family. We are taught from the time we are children that blood is thicker than water. We are taught that you owe your life, your sanity, and your absolute loyalty to the people who share your DNA, simply because they gave you a roof and a last name. But I learned the hardest lesson a person can ever learn. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you. Sometimes, the people who demand your loyalty the loudest are the ones secretly draining your bank account, your energy, and your soul. Sometimes, the bravest, most honest thing you can ever do in your entire life is to pack your bags, look the abusers right in the eye, and walk away into the dark. Because when you finally stop carrying the weight of people who refuse to carry themselves, you realize how incredibly strong you actually are. You realize you can run. You realize you can fly. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a heavy one, but it is the honest truth of how I got to where I am today. I hope this resonated with you in some way, especially if you are fighting a battle behind closed doors that nobody else sees. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to walk away from people you thought would love you forever? If you are still here, listening to the very end of this video, you are part of a very small, very elite group. I call it the 1% Club. I want you to go down into the comments right now and type the letter W. Just the letter W. It stands for winner. That is our secret code. It tells me that you are one of the amazing people who stayed until the very end, and it tells me that you understand what it takes to survive and win your life back. Please hit that like button and make sure you follow the channel. I have so many more stories to share with you, and I want you to be here for the next one. Take care of yourselves, set your boundaries, and I will see you in the next video.